So this is our fourth snippet from the Clinton period, and it looks at the '94 elections, which is, one of one of the two or three most significant midterm elections in the period that we cover in this course. The Republicans had last controlled either house of Congress in 1954, when the Democrats narrowly retake both the House and the Senate. And by the time the late '80s, early '90s come around, it seems like the Democrats just have a perpetual lock on the House. The Republicans had taken the Senate back in the 1980s, but the Democrats had reclaimed it in 1986 and had built up a healthy majority, a 14-seat majority by this time. Enter Newt Gingrich, shown here. Gingrich was a very conservative Republican congressman from suburban Atlanta, whose insight, and it was an insight, was that Republicans could retake the majority in the House by running a campaign designed to discredit Congress as an institution. He focused on what were relatively minor scandals, the House bank scandal, which had this provision where members could overdraft their account as long as they repaid it later on. He strongly campaigned against House pay raises. It was sort of a populistic campaign. And in 1994, he creates this document called the Contract with America that promises a host of changes: term limits for members of Congress, cutting the budget to create a unified opposition. And the basic argument that Gingrich is making is that Clinton is this kind of left-wing radical who campaigned as a moderate, but is governing as a liberal. We will provide a check on Clinton's approach. And Clinton is quite unpopular. And by the time the election comes down, it's simply a wipeout. All of the districts here that are in kind of the light red on this map are districts that are picked up by the Republicans from the Democrats in the 1994 midterm elections. The Democrats do pick up a couple of seats. They pick up this one seat in suburban Minnesota, but basically, the Democrats are pulverized. And if you look at this map, one of the things that you should notice from it is that there are a lot of big, relatively anyway, big congressional districts on this map. That is, that we have the districts that Republicans gain in 1994 tend to be exurban or rural districts. We see lots of districts in the South. These were sort of ancestrally Democratic districts, oftentimes with conservative Democratic incumbents, but we're okay as long as Reagan was in charge or Bush was in charge, and they could go back to their district and say, I'm voting with the president, but I'm also helping you. But by being tarnished with Clinton, they just had no chance. If you look up right here at the corner, you can just barely see it. Vermont is in yellow. That's Bernie Sanders in the House of Representatives, the only independent member of the House in the 1990s. But the Republicans retake the Senate, they take the House, and the question is, what are they going to do with it? This is not a close election. There are 11 Democratic seats that go to the Republicans where the Democrats do not get even 40% of the vote. This is extraordinarily unusual in a congressional election where a party would lose not just its seat, but would get utterly pulverized in losing its seat. And in the Senate, likewise, it's a relatively weak showing. As is often the case, you get a kind of dramatic shift. The best example of this is Washington, not an ultra-right-wing state. This was the map of Washington's House districts in 1992. The Democrats won 8 of 9 seats. The only seat that they lost was this exurban seat outside of Seattle. In 1994, by contrast, it is the Democrats who are wiped out. They win only 2 seats, one in Seattle proper and another in the Seattle-Tacoma suburbs. The remainder of the state goes Republican. 6 Democratic incumbents are defeated, including out here in far eastern Washington, in the district around Spokane, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Tom Foley, who becomes the first House Speaker since the 19th century to lose re-election. There are other big-name Democrats who lose in 1994. Mario Cuomo, current governor's father, is unseated by a relatively low-profile upstate state senator named George Pataki. Ann Richards, seen as a potential female presidential candidate perhaps down the road, loses her reelection campaign in Texas as governor of Texas to the son of the former president, George W. Bush, in what turns out to be a really important election down the line. So, it's not just minor Democrats who are losing, it's sort of big names. As is often the case, the these kind of wave elections bring in some crankish figures. The guy here on the upper left is Frederick Heinemann, who's elected from North Carolina. He's asked, he says that he doesn't want to have any tax increases, indeed wants a tax cut for all middle-class Americans. And he's asked, what's your definition of a middle-class American? Again, this is 25, 30 years ago. He says it's anyone making around $250,000 a year, which is a kind of flexible definition of what constitutes a middle-class American. John Hostetler is a congressman from downstate Indiana, is a gun advocate. Later in his term, he'll be detained when he's flying through the Louisville airport carrying his gun, and he argues that he should be able to carry his gun onto the plane. And this woman down here, Helen Chenoweth, is a congressman from Idaho. When I use the term deliberately, she insisted on being called Congressman Chenoweth. She was an ardent anti-feminist, harsh critic of environmentalists, and so you had a freshman caucus that had that was a very conservative caucus. There were a couple of problem issues in '94 long term for the Republicans. The first was in California. The governor of California, Pete Wilson, was reelected, a Republican, in 1994, and he campaigned very aggressively for this ballot measure called Proposition 187, and this is a photograph of an anti-187 rally. It called for removing all public services to undocumented immigrants. So that meant, most important, the right to go for kids of undocumented immigrants to go to school, but also healthcare issues, other sort of poverty issues. The law itself, although it won in the ballot measure, was struck down by the courts, and so never went into place. And even though it helped Wilson in 1994, the victory associated the Republican Party in California with anti-Hispanic sentiment at a time when Hispanics were the fastest growing segment of the state's population and were not terribly they were a Democratic group, but not ultra Democrat. It shifts the Hispanic vote in California well to the left and sets the stage for the creation of what's now a one-party state. And then in Massachusetts, Ted Kennedy, the longtime liberal incumbent, faces his strongest challenge at any point in his career from Mitt Romney, a financier, son of the former governor of Michigan, Republican presidential candidate in 1968, George Romney. Romney runs, it's a generational campaign. It's a very sharp campaign against Kennedy, basically making the argument that that Kennedy is old and tired, and we need new ideas. Romney, who was, if nothing else, throughout his career, continuing now as a U.S. Senator from Utah, an ideologically flexible man, maintains, among other things, that he will run, that if he were elected, he would be more liberal than Kennedy was on issues like gay rights. And so he's sort of running as this moderate in Massachusetts. And he's competitive in the polls until very late in the game, when Kennedy runs these devastating ads featuring workers who lost their jobs from plants that were purchased by Romney's finance firm, Bain Capital, and Romney just has no response. Keep this in the back of your mind, because the Obama people in 2012 will basically run the exact same ads against Romney, and he had 18 years to come up with a response, and he never quite did. But apart from that, it's a bleak night for the Democrats, and it really does move the the ideological core of Washington to the right. So that's our second snippet for this week, the 94 midterms. And then we have one more snippet, which will be coming up, which will look at how Clinton governs in 95 and 96.